The Gralian Empire was a force of nature in the galaxy, a vast and relentless power that spanned 3 galactic arms. They were the apex predators of the cosmos, their ships and cities towering over every species they encountered. Every planet they colonized was bent to their will, every species subjugated, categorized, or destroyed if they were deemed unnecessary. The Gralians were proud, calculating, and ruthless. They were the masters of the galaxy, and no one dared to challenge their dominance. It was within this empire that Jake Mercer, a simple human from Earth, would first make his mark, though he didn't know it yet. His ship, the Artemis E, a tiny, rusted exploration vessel, was the first to encounter the Gralian fleet. The humans, unaware that they were drifting into the heart of Gralian space, had no idea they were about to stumble into the Empire's grasp. The Artemis E was a primitive craft compared to the mighty Gralian warships that swarmed around it. It had no shields, no advanced weaponry, and its communication systems were as archaic as the combustion engines that powered it. The Gralian sensors detected the vessel long before it could even realize its mistake. The ship was captured near the Cygni's Arm, a region that was strictly off-limits to any species not under Gralian rule. The Gralian High Commander Vazic stood at the observation deck of the flagship Dominance, his sharp, calculating eyes trained on the small human ship. He saw no reason to be concerned. The humans were nothing, mere insects to be crushed beneath the Empire's boot. "Prepare the dissection chambers," Vazic ordered coldly, his voice echoing through the command room. "Their biology might yield some useful information." The officers obeyed swiftly, moving with military precision. Their actions were not motivated by cruelty. This was standard protocol. The Gralians had done this countless times before with thousands of species, capturing and dissecting them for scientific purposes. And once they were finished, if the species were deemed useful, they would be enslaved or catalogued. Vazic, Officer Krellel, the fleet's linguistics expert, spoke up. "Sir, the humans are attempting to communicate. They're using mathematical sequences to establish a translation matrix." Vazic's ridged face curled into a sneer. "How quaint," he said, amusement lacing his words. "Let's hear what they have to say before we dissect them. It might be entertaining." A soft voice crackled through the communications channel. The human sounded calm, even composed, as though he had no idea of the grave danger he was in. "This is Lieutenant Jake Mercer of Earth's Artemis E expedition. We come in peace and seek diplomatic relations." Vazic's amusement quickly shifted to confusion. Diplomatic relations, with a species that had no advanced weapons, no fleet, and whose technology was stuck in the Dark Ages. The idea was laughable. "Tell this Jake Mercer that the Gralian Empire does not negotiate with lesser species," Vazic said, flicking his feeding tentacles in dismissal. "Prepare them for processing. I grow bored already." As the tractor beams locked onto the Artemis E and the crew was dragged from the ship, there was no fear in the humans' eyes, only confusion. They wore flimsy white suits with transparent bubbles over their heads, hardly the gear for survival in a hostile environment. Jake Mercer, however, remained oddly calm. His eyes were sharp, watching everything. The weapon systems, the guard rotations, the way the Gralians moved with calculated efficiency. Even as his crew was separated and dragged away for study, Jake stood tall, never flinching. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice soft but filled with a strange confidence. Vazic stared at him, irritation flaring. "What could your species do, human? You are 20 light years from your homeworld. Your most advanced weapon is a nuclear bomb, and we crack moons for mining. You will die here, forgotten by your people, who will never know what happened to their lost explorers." Jake Mercer's expression never changed. His smile, though small, was unsettling. "We'll see," he said. "You'll see what humans can do." Jake Mercer had been confined to Droth prison for months now. The Gralians had built this facility deep beneath their military moon, a place reserved for the most dangerous prisoners of war. The walls were made of pitch-black metal that absorbed light, creating a sense of perpetual darkness, even during the artificial daylight hours. It was a cell designed for despair, designed to break any creature, no matter how strong. But Jake Mercer wasn't just any creature. The Gralians had never faced a prisoner like him. His human body, so frail and fragile in comparison to their own, was subjected to every imaginable form of isolation and torture the Empire could conceive. Yet, he remained unbroken. His cell was no larger than a few meters in any direction, completely sealed, and designed to induce both physical and mental suffering. There was no natural light, no warmth, and the gravity fluctuations could reach up to 3 times what his body was accustomed to. Nutrients were withheld to starve him slowly, and they pumped in hallucinogenic gases to make him lose his grip on reality. But every time they checked his vitals, his heart rate remained steady. His brain activity, normal. The guards watched, confused and frustrated. They had never encountered a species that could endure what they had thrown at Jake Mercer. The humans, it seemed, were simply different from everything the Grolians had catalogued. "How is he still alive?" Officer Gorin muttered to himself as he examined the latest data on his screen. "He should be a wreck by now." Vazek, the Grolian commander, was equally perplexed. "We've increased the gravity, withheld food, subjected him to pain induction, and yet he still does." "Nothing," Vazek spat, his ridges twitching in irritation. The monitors in front of them flickered, and a new feed appeared. In the small, dark cell, Jake Mercer was moving, his arms and legs performing strange, repetitive movements. "What is he doing?" Gorin asked, watching the footage in disbelief. Jake, oblivious to the cameras or the guards' scrutiny, continued his exercises. It was a series of movements he had adapted to survive in the harshest conditions, a set of motions that, if done long enough, could stimulate his circulation, stretch his body, and keep him from succumbing to the debilitating effects of sensory deprivation. It was a form of survival he had learned back on Earth, something called burpees, a simple exercise involving falling to the floor and getting back up. The human had been doing this for hours. Vazek's expression shifted from irritation to something else, curiosity, perhaps. "What's the human doing?" he asked again, quieter this time. "I don't know," Gorin said, his voice filled with unease. "But he's doing it perfectly." Despite the extreme conditions, Jake remained steady. Even the emotional toll the Grolians had expected him to succumb to, despair, madness, never arrived. Instead, the human seemed oddly at peace, even performing his strange exercises with a sort of grim determination. He wasn't just surviving, he was adapting. In the days that followed, something even more unsettling began to occur. Jake Mercer, while doing his exercise routines, began singing. The guards had never heard anything like it. The song was a strange, upbeat tune, one that seemed entirely out of place in the oppressive prison. It was an old Earth anthem, one called Eye of the Tiger, a song that spoke of perseverance in the face of adversity. At first, the guards thought it was just noise and eccentricity, something to mock. But the longer Jake Mercer kept singing, the more unnerving it became. His voice was unwavering, his tone calm, as if he were completely unfazed by the pain, the isolation, or the surety of his impending death. "Have we been giving him too much oxygen?" Gorin asked with a touch of sarcasm, attempting to understand the absurdity of the situation. "No," Vazek said, his voice low with barely contained frustration. "His vitals are normal, his heart rate is stable, he's adjusting. This human is different." The more Jake Mercer endured, the more his captors began to realize. He wasn't just surviving captivity, he was defying it. The guards weren't sure what it meant, but the psychological games they'd been taught to use weren't working. Weeks later, when they'd expected him to break, Jake did something that stunned even the Grolians. While they increased the pressure on him, pushing him with more invasive tactics, Jake continued to hold his ground. When one of the Grolian guards came to check on him, Jake simply looked up with a small, wry smile. "You've been watching me," Jake said, his voice oddly calm for someone locked in a cell designed to break him. "I see you, but the question is, what's your plan once I break you?" The guard froze, caught off guard. This was not what they expected. This wasn't the behavior of a prisoner who had been left alone for so long. The human was aware. A curious encounter. The effects of Jake's resilience were starting to ripple through Droth prison. He wasn't just surviving, he was becoming a problem for the Grolians. His behavior, while strange, had an unsettling quality. He wasn't cowering in fear. He wasn't screaming for mercy. Instead, he was watching them, learning their routines, and most disturbingly, he was beginning to predict their moves. Months passed. Then one day, something extraordinary happened. Jake was transferred to the psychological ward of Droth, the place where the most mentally broken prisoners were sent. The Grolians had decided that a change of environment might finally break him. But as they moved Jake into the new cell, he turned to one of the guards, who had always been skeptical of his endurance. "Good morning, Officer Kelvin," Jake said with that same unnerving smile. "How's the family? Your youngest is about to reach molt stage, isn't she?" The guard's expression shifted from one of boredom to something resembling surprise. "How do you know that?" Jake's smile deepened. "I've been watching you, your every move. I'm better at observing than you think." Jake Mercer wasn't just surviving. He was studying his captors, learning their weaknesses and routines. The idea that this fragile human could gather information while under constant surveillance unsettled the Grolian officers deeply. For the first time, they began to question something fundamental. Was their prison system truly infallible? For weeks, Jake had been testing their every boundary, psychologically, physically, and now, with his ability to predict behavior mentally. The question hung in the air like an unresolved tension. Could one human truly bring down an entire empire? As the months passed in Droth, Jake Mercer's mind was far from broken. Instead, it was beginning to grow sharper, stronger, and more dangerous than the Grolians could have ever anticipated. The longer they kept him in captivity, the more he began to infiltrate their systems, their minds, in ways they couldn't understand. The Grolians thought they were controlling the human, but in reality, Jake Mercer was quietly preparing for something far bigger, a revolution. Jake Mercer had been imprisoned for almost a year, but the longer the Grolians kept him in Droth prison, the clearer it became. They had underestimated him. What began as an effort to break a prisoner who had wandered too far into Grolian territory had transformed into a complex psychological game, one that the Grolians were losing. They had thrown everything they had at him: physical punishment, isolation, mental manipulation, and torture. And yet, Jake Mercer had endured it all. At first, the Grolians believed their strategy would break him. After all, they had perfected their techniques on thousands of species. No one had ever lasted as long as Jake. His human physiology, fragile compared to theirs, should have given in long before now. But Jake was different. His body, though weak by their standards, adapted to the conditions. His mind, however, was what truly baffled them. Jake didn't just survive their methods, he thrived. He began to adapt his exercises to the environment, working out in the fluctuating gravity and using the sensory deprivation to focus and meditate. He even began to memorize the sounds of the guards' footsteps, learning the rhythms of their shifts. His resilience was one thing, but it was what he did with that resilience that would ultimately turn the tables. A growing influence. In his cell, Jake had spent the better part of his imprisonment doing something unexpected. He had started writing. At first, it was nothing more than a way to pass the time, a form of catharsis. He wrote about Earth, about the people he loved, about the stars he had gazed at before his ship had been captured. But over time, his writings changed. They became less about Earth and more about the galaxy, about the Grolian Empire and its tyranny. Jake didn't just see himself as a prisoner anymore. He saw himself as something else, a leader in the making. He began to craft messages, not just for himself, but for the others around him, especially the other prisoners in Droth. He began to whisper through the cracks of his cell, sharing ideas, planting seeds of doubt. He wasn't the only one locked away. There were others, species from across the galaxy, who had been captured, catalogued, and enslaved by the Grolian Empire. They had been tortured, experimented on, and left to rot in their cells. But Jake had found a way to connect with them. He spoke to them about Earth, about freedom, and about resistance. He was careful at first, letting his words trickle out in fragments. He had learned, through painful observation, how to break through the Grolian mental blocks that kept the prisoners from rebelling. He shared stories of human resistance, of how a small, insignificant species could stand up to the might of empires and win. He talked about hope and unity, about the strength of standing together. The other prisoners listened, some cautiously, others with growing hope. Jake's words were strange to them. For most, the idea of resistance had been a fantasy, something that only the old, defeated species dreamed about. But now here was a human, one prisoner, who spoke with conviction, and what's more, he wasn't just talking, he was acting. Every day, Jake built relationships with the prisoners. He learned their languages, their cultures, their histories. He listened, and in return, they listened to him. The walls between species slowly began to erode, and an unspoken bond of trust began to form. The mysterious commander, Parvik. While Jake was making his mark on the prisoners, something even more unusual was happening on the Grolian side. Commander Parvik, one of the most respected and rigid officers in the Grolian military, began to take an unexpected interest in Jake Mercer. Liz had always been known for her discipline and strategic mind. She was not one to indulge in the emotional aspects of leadership, preferring cold, calculated precision in every move she made. But Jake Mercer had gotten under her skin in a way no prisoner ever had. At first, she had been assigned to oversee his interrogation, but over time she began to question the very methods that had been used to break him. His composure, his strength, his refusal to bend, all of it intrigued her. Liz had been briefed on the human's resistance to Grolian tactics. Yet, as she watched Jake in his cell, she began to see something that no one else did. It wasn't just his physical endurance or his ability to predict guard shifts. It was the way he carried himself. The way he held on to his humanity, even when everything around him was designed to strip it away. On a quiet afternoon, Liz decided to visit Jake's cell. She had no real reason for the visit, no directive from high command. It was a personal decision, one that she would later question. Jake was sitting on the floor, his back pressed against the cold metal wall of his cell, eyes closed in concentration. When Liz stepped into the doorway, he opened his eyes and looked at her, unperturbed. "You're the commander," Jake said, his voice casual, though a slight edge of curiosity played in his tone. "I've seen you on the surveillance feeds." Liz nodded. "Yes, I've been assigned to you." Jake tilted his head slightly. "Assigned to me, huh? Well, I'm sure that's a fascinating job for you, but I'm not exactly the easiest guy to deal with." Liz didn't react immediately. She stood still for a moment, just observing him. There was something about Jake Mercer that made her uneasy, something that didn't quite fit the pattern of the prisoners she had dealt with. "What do you want from me?" she finally asked. Jake smiled, but it wasn't the unsettling grin he usually wore. This one was different, softer, almost weary. "I don't want anything, Commander, not from you, but you might want something from me." Liz raised an eyebrow, and what might that be? Jake leaned back against the wall, his arms crossed. "Knowledge," he said. "Information, the kind of things you can't get from just reading data files or conducting experiments." Liz narrowed her eyes. "And why would I want that from you?" "Because," Jake said, his voice quiet, "I'm not just a prisoner, I'm a problem, and you're starting to realize it." It was a simple, offhand remark, but it struck Liz harder than she had expected. She had thought herself immune to manipulation, but there was something about Jake that unsettled her in ways she couldn't explain. She had seen countless prisoners come and go, broken and defeated, but Jake Mercer, he was different. As she left the cell that day, Liz couldn't shake the feeling that the human had won their first encounter, not by force, but by something more subtle. He had made her see him, not just as a prisoner, but as something far more dangerous, a spark of something that could ignite an entire galaxy. The seeds of rebellion. Jake Mercer's influence continued to spread within Droth prison. Slowly but surely, the prisoners began to change. They no longer saw themselves as victims, as subjects of Grolian oppression. They began to see themselves as actors in their own fates. They were no longer passive. They were learning, adapting, and planning. Jake Mercer had not just survived captivity, he had turned it into something more. He had transformed Droth into a microcosm of rebellion, a place where ideas, hope, and courage could grow. He had done the impossible. He had united enemies, brought together species that had been pitted against each other for centuries, and shown them a path forward, a path where they could fight back. The Grolians had thought Jake Mercer's capture would be the end of him, but they were wrong. In his captivity, Jake had found his greatest strength, not in his physical resilience, but in his mind. His ability to connect with others, to empathize, and to lead was something the Grolians could never have anticipated, and it was that strength that would ultimately lead to their downfall. As the months wore on, the prisoners of Droth began to ask themselves a simple question. If one human could resist, could they? Jake had already shown them that they could, and that was the spark that would ignite the fire. It was the most unlikely of places, Droth Prison, a cold, lifeless facility on the remote moon of the Grolian Empire. A place where species were broken, where even the strongest minds were bent to the will of Grolian authority. It was designed to strip all hope, all resistance, and turn beings into nothing more than subjects to the Empire's will. But in this very place, Jake Mercer had planted the seeds of a rebellion. The turning point. The Grolian Empire, confident in its supreme control over Droth Prison, had failed to notice something important. Jake Mercer wasn't just surviving. He was evolving. He was taking the oppression, the confinement, and turning it into a lesson, something that no other species had ever done before. Over the months, he had engaged in conversations with his fellow prisoners, quietly sowing the ideas of freedom and resistance, one small, insidious idea at a time. It started with subtle shifts in behavior. Prisoners who had once been broken, subjugated by years of Grolian brutality, began to look at Jake differently. The guards still watched him with suspicion, but in the silent spaces between surveillance checks, Jake's words took root. And one by one, the prisoners began to realize that their fate didn't have to be sealed, that they could fight back. They didn't have to remain docile. They didn't have to accept the Grolian Empire's iron grip over their lives. Jake's words weren't just stirring hope, they were inspiring action. In the weeks leading up to the prison riot, Jake had carefully laid the groundwork. He spoke to the prisoners about the weaknesses of their captors, about how they could use the Grolians' overconfidence against them. He told them stories about Earth, about how humans had resisted tyrannical regimes throughout history. He talked about teamwork, strategy, and most importantly, about freedom. The more they talked, the more they understood. This was no longer just a matter of survival. This was a fight for their future. The day of the riot. It happened on a routine cycle. The Grolians had scheduled a routine systems diagnostic across Droth Prison, an event that involved shutting down and restarting several of the prison's key systems for maintenance. It was supposed to be a simple procedure, one that the Grolians had done 1,000 times before. But this time, something went wrong. A minor power fluctuation in one of the prisoner blocks triggered the backup systems. In less than a minute, secondary alarms sounded throughout the facility, signaling a containment failure. The systems weren't responding as they should have, and the emergency lockdown protocols failed to engage. This was no accident. Jake Mercer had known the system would fail. He had spent months studying Droth's infrastructure, learning its weaknesses, and now he was going to use that knowledge to his advantage. With the power grids flickering and security systems down, prisoners saw their chance. They rose up. Jake's cell door, which should have remained locked, slid open with a soft hiss. He stepped out, his mind sharp, his body prepared. Around him, chaos erupted. Prisoners who had once been broken now rushed through the halls, seizing the opportunity. They attacked guards, took weapons, and freed their fellow captives. Jake didn't join in the violence, though. He had planned this moment carefully. His goal was not just to cause a riot. It was to take control, to show the Grolians that they could no longer dominate the galaxy with brute force. The guards, initially caught off guard by the sudden uprising, tried to respond, but the Grolians had no idea how to handle this. They had never dealt with a coordinated revolt in Droth before. The prisoners didn't fight aimlessly, they worked together. They had learned from Jake. They knew the value of strategy, of not just attacking, but of organizing. Jake moved through the chaos, heading straight for the central command center, where Commander Drav had assumed control after the last round of executions. He knew that Drav would be in charge, and he needed Drav to see him, needed him to understand that this was no ordinary uprising. Jake had one mission: to negotiate. As Jake made his way through the corridors, he passed other prisoners now rallying around him, led by his calm resolve. His presence, despite the madness of the revolt, was steady and unwavering. He moved with purpose, not an ounce of hesitation in his step. He knew exactly where he was going. The showdown. When Jake reached the command center, the doors were locked and heavily guarded. But he didn't hesitate. He approached the entrance, his expression calm. A Grolian officer trying to secure the area raised a weapon at him. "Stop right there," the officer barked. Jake smiled that strange, unsettling smile, the same one that had unnerved the Grolian guards for months. "I'm not here to fight, officer," he said, his voice carrying with an odd sense of authority. "I'm here to end this." The officer hesitated, glancing at his surroundings, but then lowered his weapon. Jake stepped forward, and with a wave of his hand, the officer stepped aside. The doors to the command center opened. Inside, Commander Drav was coordinating with a handful of Grolian officers. They all turned to face Jake as he entered. Drav's face twisted in disbelief. Jake Mercer, the human they had confined for so long, had just walked into their most secure room with no resistance. And what's more, he was calm. Even more than that, he was confident. "Jake Mercer," Drav said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You must be here to die." Jake shook his head. "No, Drav, I'm here to make you an offer." Drav's anger flared. "An offer? You think you can negotiate with me? You're a prisoner, you don't get to make offers." Jake didn't flinch. "You're right, I am a prisoner, but that doesn't mean I can't offer something valuable. I'm here to give you a choice." Drav raised an eyebrow. "And what would that be?" Jake's voice was steady, even as the chaos outside grew louder. You can keep fighting and you can try to hold this prison together. You can try to crush every species here, or you can listen to me and you can end this. We can stop the violence and save lives." Drav's eyes narrowed. "You think you can stop this? A human?" He laughed bitterly, the sound echoing through the chamber. "I don't think I can stop it, Drav," Jake said softly. "But I think we can, all of us together." For a moment there was silence. The Gralian officers stared at each other, unsure of what to do. Jake Mercer wasn't just a prisoner anymore. He wasn't a threat. They had seen that over the months. He was something far more dangerous. He was a leader. And that was the one thing the Gralian Empire couldn't control. Commander Drav's expression faltered just for a moment. And in that moment, Jake knew he had won. The Gralians had no choice but to listen. And when they did, it would be the beginning of the end. "The deal? I'm not here to destroy you," Jake continued, his voice calm but unwavering. "I'm here to show you that the old way doesn't work anymore. You can't keep ruling by fear. The galaxy is changing, and if you don't adapt, you're going to lose everything." Drav stood frozen for a moment, his hand clenched around his weapon. But his eyes, his calculating, cold eyes, began to shift as if he were weighing the possibilities. Jake's words had struck something deep within him. "You think we'll just hand over power?" Drav asked, his voice now tinged with a hint of doubt. "The Gralian Empire has reigned for thousands of years. We will not fall to a prisoner." Jake nodded. "You're right, you won't fall to me, but you will fall to the truth. The truth is that your empire, built on oppression and fear, is already crumbling. I'm offering you a chance to save what's left of it, to transition from an empire to something more, something better." The room fell silent as the officers exchanged uncertain glances. No one spoke. No one moved. Finally, Commander Drav spoke again, his voice softer now. "What do you want, Mercer? What is it you're asking for?" Jake stepped forward, his confidence unwavering. "I'm asking you to end this senseless violence. I'm asking you to negotiate for peace." Drav stared at him, his mind racing. And then, in a move that shocked everyone in the room, he slowly lowered his weapon. "Fine," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "We'll listen, but know this, human, you've made a dangerous enemy." Jake smiled that strange, unsettling smile again. "I already have, Commander, but I'm not here to make enemies. I'm here to build something new." And so the negotiation began. The Gralian Empire, for the first time in its history, would be forced to listen to the humans. And in doing so, they would begin to understand that the galaxy was changing in ways they couldn't stop. But the seeds had been planted, and the rebellion had only just begun. The day Droth prison erupted into chaos was one that the Gralians would never forget. It began as a simple malfunction, an ordinary system's diagnostic cycle meant to check the status of their prison's defenses. But this time, something went terribly wrong. Jake Mercer had anticipated it. For months, he had studied the prison's infrastructure, the guards' routines, and the internal communication systems. He knew the flaws, the pressure points, and the perfect moment to strike. As he had told the prisoners many times, the Gralians were too arrogant, too confident in their own invulnerability, and that was their fatal mistake. The first sign of trouble was the power fluctuation in Block E, the most violent section of Droth. It was supposed to be a minor issue, a glitch in the system that would be corrected in seconds. But as the backup systems failed to engage, secondary alarms rang out across the prison. The walls, once an impenetrable barrier, began to hum and flicker. The Gralians had designed Droth to be the most secure prison in the galaxy, but they had never anticipated that someone inside would have the knowledge to exploit their weaknesses. Jake's cell door slid open with a soft hiss, unnoticed by the guards in the chaos. He stepped out, his expression calm, his movements deliberate. Around him, the prisoners, those who had once been broken by the Gralian Empire, began to stir. At first, it was just a few. One prisoner broke into a run, taking out a guard with a well-placed blow. Then another joined in. The spark had been lit. Jake didn't rush into the fray. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. His calm authority, built over months of patient observation, was like a beacon, drawing the prisoners together. They had been waiting for a sign, waiting for someone to show them that they were not powerless. Now they had found it. The surge of resistance. In moments, the atmosphere of the prison had shifted. What had once been a place of despair and isolation had become a battlefield. The Gralian guards scrambled to respond, but they were outnumbered and disorganized. The prisoners, with Jake leading them from the front, knew the layout of Droth. They knew the weak spots, the security flaws that the Grolians had overlooked for so long. Jake had planned every step. He had spent days in isolation, studying the guards' shifts, memorizing the positions of the surveillance cameras, and learning the patterns of the prison's automated systems. He understood that brute force wasn't the answer. What he needed was precision. He needed to disrupt the Grolians' control over the prison and force them into a corner where they couldn't respond effectively. He knew exactly where to strike. With the prison's power grid malfunctioning, the emergency lockdown protocols had failed. Guards, once secure in their control of the facility, found themselves scrambling for answers. The prisoners took full advantage. They breached their cells and overran the security checkpoints. Jake didn't stop. He moved swiftly through the chaos, heading straight for the central command center. This wasn't just a prison break, it was a message. It was the beginning of something far bigger. He had been teaching the prisoners, quietly building a foundation of unity. Now they would see it come to life. The confrontation with Commander Drav. When Jake arrived at the command center, he found it already under siege. Grolian officers, trying to maintain order, were fighting to secure the most strategic position in the prison. Commander Drav, the officer who had taken control after the last wave of executions, stood in the center of the chaos, barking orders to his subordinates. He had no idea how to respond to this sudden uprising. Jake approached the doors to the command center, unarmed and with no weapons at his disposal. His body was calm, his mind sharper than ever. He knew this was the moment where everything would change. If the Grolians were going to maintain their control, they needed to deal with Jake Mercer. The moment the guards saw him approach, they raised their weapons, but Jake raised his hand in a nonchalant gesture. "I'm not here to fight," he said calmly, his voice carrying through the air like a wave of authority. "I'm here to talk." One of the guards hesitated. In that split second, Jake's calculated presence had already made an impact. The doors to the command center opened. Commander Drav, clearly surprised to see Jake Mercer standing in the middle of the chaos, narrowed his eyes. "Mercer," Drav sneered, "I should have known you'd be behind this." Jake didn't flinch. "I didn't start this," he said, his voice steady. "But I'm here to end it. You've lost control." Drav clenched his jaw, his mind working rapidly. "You think you can negotiate with me? With us? You're a prisoner, Mercer. You're not in a position to make demands." Jake met his gaze unwaveringly. "I'm not making demands. I'm offering you a chance to save the lives of your men and stop this madness before it escalates further." Drav scoffed, his hands tightening around the weapon in his grip. "You've lost your mind. The Grolian Empire doesn't negotiate with insurgents." Jake took a step forward, his calm demeanor sending a ripple through the Grolian officers. "You're wrong, Drav. Your empire is collapsing. You just don't see it yet. But you will. If you keep fighting, if you continue down this path, you'll only destroy yourselves faster." Drav's eyes narrowed, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced at his officers, who were growing increasingly uneasy. Jake Mercer had been nothing but a thorn in their side for months, but now here he was, standing before them, unbroken, unafraid. "You think you can win this, Mercer? You and your ragtag group of prisoners?" Drav spat, his voice laced with disbelief. Jake's smile was small but genuine. "It's not about winning, it's about surviving. You're not the only ones who understand strategy, Drav. You've been playing the game with all the rules stacked in your favor, but the rules are changing now. This rebellion isn't just about me. It's about everyone you've oppressed." Jake didn't wait for Drav's response. "It's not too late for you to stop this," he said softly. "You can stop the bloodshed, you can make a deal, you can let the prisoners go, and we'll let you leave with your life." For a long moment there was silence. Drav looked at Jake Mercer, then at his officers. His pride, his confidence had been shattered. This human, this prisoner who had been nothing but a source of frustration for months, was now forcing him to make a decision that would change everything. The moment of decision. It was then that Drav understood. Jake Mercer wasn't just a prisoner, he was something far more dangerous. He had outsmarted the Grolian Empire, not with weapons or force, but with something they had never prepared for: words. The ability to inspire, to unite, to offer something other than destruction. Jake wasn't offering peace out of weakness. He was offering it out of strength, the strength of understanding, of knowing that no empire could hold onto power forever if it didn't change. The weight of the decision settled over Drav. He could continue to fight and die for an empire that had already begun to crumble, or he could listen to the human before him, this prisoner who had broken the mold. For the first time in his life, Drav felt uncertainty. Jake stood there waiting, his gaze unwavering. He didn't know if Drav would take the offer, but the seed had been planted. Whether the Gralian commander agreed to it or not, Jake Mercer had already started something that could never be stopped. The revolt had only just begun, but it was no longer a matter of survival. It was a revolution. And Jake Mercer would lead it. Jake Mercer's words had been a catalyst, but what followed was something that no one, not the Gralians, not the prisoners, could have predicted. The Gralian Empire had underestimated human adaptability, their stubbornness, and their ability to turn impossible situations into opportunities. And now Jake wasn't just leading a small revolt in Droth prison. He was shaping a revolution that would spread beyond the confines of this moon, beyond Droth's walls, and across the entire Gralian Empire. The beginning of a unified front. After the tense standoff with Commander Drav, the tide began to shift. The prisoners, once fragmented by species and circumstance, had been united under Jake Mercer's vision. He had shown them that their greatest strength lay in their unity, not their individual differences. Jake knew that this wasn't just about Droth prison anymore. His goal was far grander than a simple escape. If he could turn the prisoners into a force capable of challenging the Gralians' control of Droth, then perhaps, just perhaps, he could spread that force beyond the prison walls. Every conversation he had with the prisoners was a lesson in cooperation. He shared Earth's history of revolutions, rebellions, and resistance movements that had toppled far greater empires than the Gralians could ever hope to be. He taught them to think strategically, to focus not on brute strength, but on undermining the empire's infrastructure, using its own arrogance against it. The prisoners, once docile and broken, began to listen. They began to believe in the possibility of something more than mere survival. They had been forgotten by the galaxy, subjugated and exploited by the Gralians for centuries. But under Jake's leadership, they began to see their own potential. Jake's voice became the rallying cry for the oppressed. His charisma, despite the situation, was undeniable. Even the Gralian officers, those who had been sure of their control, were beginning to realize that something had changed. The quiet spread of rebellion. It wasn't long before the rebellion spread. At first, the Gralians dismissed it as a fluke, a group of prisoners causing trouble in one prison. They were wrong. Jake had planted the idea in Droth, and that idea began to ripple outward, reaching other subjugated species who had been similarly oppressed by the Gralians. The Empire had long relied on the belief that their strength was unmatched, that no one could rise against them. But in the depths of Droth, a spark had been lit. Prisoners from different sectors began to communicate with one another. They shared Jake's teachings, spreading messages of unity, resilience, and hope. As the prisoners in Droth grew bolder, other prisons and labor camps across the Gralian Empire began to stir with the same fire. Jake's ideas were spreading, but more than that, the Gralians were starting to see the cracks in their empire. The rebellion wasn't just happening in Droth, it was happening everywhere. Jake, however, didn't rush in with a full frontal assault. His strategy was patient, calculated. Every move he made was deliberate. He understood the power of disruption, the importance of timing. He knew that if they were going to have a chance against the Gralians, they would have to take down the Empire's systems from within. He began sabotaging the prison's security infrastructure, not through brute force, but by subtle manipulation. Jake planted small devices in critical areas of the prison, each one designed to cause a ripple effect in the prison's security systems. One small malfunction led to another. A guard left their post for a split second. A security feed went down for just a moment. An entire shift rotation was thrown off track. The Gralians had built their empire on precision and control, but Jake's rebellion was a slow, steady erosion. The Gralians relied too much on their own power and couldn't see how vulnerable they were to disruption. The Gralian response. Commander Drav, still reeling from the earlier standoff with Jake, could no longer ignore the growing unrest within Droth prison. He summoned the senior officers for an emergency meeting. The tension was palpable in the air. Drav was not a man known for his patience, and as the reports from Droth piled up, his fury grew. "This has gone far beyond a simple prisoner uprising," Drav growled, his voice tight with frustration. "We've lost control of Droth. I want that human broken, I want him destroyed, and I want every prisoner involved in this revolt dealt with, now. But the senior officers were hesitant. Jake Mercer had become a symbol, not just in Droth, but across the prison system. They didn't understand him, and that lack of understanding terrified them. "You're underestimating him," one officer, a seasoned interrogator named Lisparvik, said cautiously. "Jake Mercer isn't like any other prisoner we've faced. He's inspiring them. He's turned the tide." Drav's gaze snapped to Liss. "Are you suggesting we negotiate with him?" "No, sir," Liss replied, her voice steady. "I'm suggesting that we need a different approach. If we keep pushing him with force, we will lose. We need to understand why he's doing this, why he's unbreakable." Drav remained silent for a long moment, his fingers tapping against the table. "Fine," he said finally. "We'll bring him in, but if he resists, we'll crush him." Lisparvik knew that this was a critical moment. The Grolians were proud, but even their pride had limits. Jake Mercer wasn't just a prisoner. He was a force that could undermine the entire empire if they didn't deal with him properly. But that didn't mean they could just crush him. The Grolians had made that mistake before. The human spark. Meanwhile, in Droth prison, Jake's influence was growing. More and more prisoners began to follow him, not out of fear, but out of respect. The lessons he had taught them were taking root. They weren't just breaking out of their cells, they were breaking the walls inside their minds. Jake wasn't just teaching them to fight. He was teaching them to believe in something bigger, something that stretched beyond the walls of Droth, beyond the Empire. He was teaching them the power of unity, how different species could come together for a common cause. With each passing day, the prisoners of Droth grew bolder and Jake grew more confident in his plan. He had learned from his experiences with the Grolians. He understood their weaknesses, their blind spots. And he knew that the only way to win was to force the Grolians to change, not just their tactics, but their entire way of thinking. He wasn't asking for victory. He wasn't asking for a revolution. He was showing them how to survive together. And in doing so, he was changing the very fabric of the Grolian Empire. And as Jake continued to play the game, the walls around Droth began to crack. The Grolians had underestimated humanity, but Jake Mercer had proven one undeniable fact. Sometimes it wasn't the size of the army or the strength of the weapons that won the battle. It was the will to fight, to survive. As Droth prison descended further into chaos, the Grolian Empire, which had once been an unstoppable force, found itself struggling to regain control. Commander Drav, still shaken by the events leading up to the revolt, understood that the rebellion within Droth was no longer a minor issue. It had become a significant threat, one that could spread beyond the prison walls and across the entire Grolian-controlled galaxy. For the first time, the Grolians faced a challenge they couldn't simply crush with their military might. Jake Mercer had taken the fight to them, not with weapons, but with ideas, diplomacy, and an unbreakable will. His influence over the prisoners had grown to an alarming level. The chaos in Droth was not just the result of an isolated revolt. It was the beginning of something larger, a threat to the very fabric of Grolian rule. The Grolian response, a show of force. High Command was watching the situation unfold with increasing anxiety. As news of the revolt in Droth spread to other parts of the Grolian Empire, there was a growing realization that Jake Mercer's influence had spread beyond the prison. The Grolians had underestimated human resilience, and now they were facing the consequences. They knew that if they didn't contain the rebellion now, it could ignite uprisings across their entire empire. Commander Drav, under immense pressure from High Command, had no choice but to escalate their response. Grolian reinforcements, elite forces from the Imperial Guard, were dispatched to Droth to quell the uprising with overwhelming force. There would be no negotiation, no second chances. Jake Mercer had crossed the line, and now the Grolians intended to put an end to his rebellion once and for all. But Jake Mercer was prepared. He had expected the Grolians to send reinforcements. He knew that their response would be swift, violent, and ruthless, and he was ready. Jake's countermove, psychological warfare. While the Grolians prepared to launch a full-scale assault on the prison, Jake took a different approach. He knew that brute force wasn't the answer. His victory lay in his ability to undermine the Grolians' sense of control, to break their confidence without ever lifting a weapon. If they couldn't break him, they would break themselves. Jake's plan was simple but effective. He began to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of the Grolian soldiers. He knew that their greatest weakness was their arrogance, their belief in their own superiority. By targeting the guards, confidence, and their sense of security, he could turn their own forces against them. Through covert means, Jake managed to send messages to the Gralian soldiers in Droth, messages that were designed to disrupt their morale. He used their own communication channels, hacking into the prison systems to send broadcasts and messages to the guards, filling their minds with fear and uncertainty. The messages were subtle at first, small, cryptic warnings about the Gralian Empire's inevitable fall, about the power of unity among the prisoners, about the cracks beginning to form within their supposedly invincible empire. At first, the Gralians dismissed these as the ramblings of a desperate prisoner. But soon, the messages became more direct, more personal. "Your empire is built on lies," one message read. "You may be soldiers, but you are not invincible. The prisoners of Droth know your weaknesses. You may think you're here to suppress us, but in reality, you're being led into a trap." At first, the guards laughed it off. They were trained to deal with rebellious prisoners, but the messages didn't stop. They began to question their orders, their loyalty, and the very foundations of the Gralian Empire. The psychological pressure started to build. Jake Mercer had understood the power of psychological warfare from the beginning. He knew that if he could erode the Gralians' confidence, even the mightiest of armies would crumble from within. It wasn't just about fighting back. It was about making them question their own strength. The turning point, the failure of the Empire's might. As Jake's messages spread, the Gralian reinforcements arrived on Droth with overwhelming force. They were prepared to crush the rebellion in a single decisive strike. But when they arrived, something unexpected happened. The elite Gralian soldiers found themselves confronted not by a ragtag group of prisoners, but by an organized, determined force that fought back with more than just desperation. It was as though the very air on Droth had changed. There was a new energy, a new purpose among the prisoners. They were no longer just surviving, they were fighting for something greater. The Gralian soldiers, once confident in their superior training and technology, began to hesitate. Their weapons, once tools of unquestionable control, felt heavy in their hands. Every strike, every clash with the prisoners seemed to chip away at their sense of invincibility. They had come to Droth expecting to restore order, to remind the prisoners who was in charge. But instead, they found themselves facing something they hadn't prepared for: unity. Jake Mercer had done what no one else could. He had turned the tables, not with strength, but with conviction, with the ability to make his enemies question everything they had ever believed in. The clash of ideals. The fighting in Droth grew intense as the Gralians struggled to regain control. Their reinforcements, once a symbol of their absolute dominance, now became a liability. They had underestimated Jake Mercer, and now they were paying the price. As the battle raged, Commander Drav made his way to the heart of the prison, determined to personally oversee the suppression of the revolt. When Drav entered the command center, he was met with chaos. The Gralian officers, who had been so confident just hours before, were now disoriented and on edge. They had been fighting for hours, but the prisoners were not just resisting, they were gaining ground. The prisoners were organized, their attacks coordinated, and they were relentless. Drav's officers, who had once been fearless in the face of rebellion, were now questioning their own tactics. "Report," Drav barked, his voice tense. "Commander," one of the officers responded, his voice strained. "The prisoners are more organized than we expected. We've lost contact with the central security hub, and several of the perimeter defenses have been sabotaged. We're being flanked." Drav's jaw tightened. "No matter, we still have the upper hand. We will crush them. The Gralian Empire does not bow to rebels." But even as he spoke, Drav couldn't shake the nagging feeling in his chest. The Gralian Empire's grip on Droth was slipping, and it wasn't just the prisoners' resistance that had caused it. It was the psychological warfare. It was Jake Mercer's influence over the minds of his soldiers. Jake's presence was a shadow hanging over the Gralian military. His calm, unyielding resistance had broken through their defenses in ways no weapon ever could. The Gralian Empire had taught their soldiers to fight with might and force, but they had never prepared for the power of the mind, the strength of hope in the face of impossible odds. The countdown begins. The final blow came in the form of a message, a single final transmission from Jake Mercer to Commander Drav. The Gralian officer stood before his communication panel, watching the transmission as it flickered to life. Jake's face appeared on the screen, calm, composed, and smiling, as though the chaos of battle was a distant memory. "I told you this was coming, Drav," Jake's voice echoed through the room. "You've lost, not just Droth, not just the prisoners, but your empire. You can't keep ruling through fear anymore." Drav's face twisted with rage. "You think you've won, Mercer?" "No," Jake replied simply. "But you will, you'll see. Your empire's already crumbling. The prisoners are no longer just prisoners. They are a force, and we are coming for you." With those words, the transmission ended. Drav stood frozen, his mind racing. The power of Jake's words had hit harder than any weapon could. For the first time, he realized that the Gralian Empire wasn't just losing a prison riot. It was losing an entire way of life. The very foundations of the Empire had been shaken, not by the strength of its enemies, but by the power of one man's resolve. The Gralian Empire's fall had begun, not in a blaze of battle, but in the quiet collapse of its own confidence. As Jake Mercer continued to spread his message, the Gralian Empire began to unravel from within. The seeds had been planted, and the revolution that had started in Droth prison was only the beginning. The Gralians had never imagined that their downfall would come from one human prisoner, and now they had no choice but to face the truth. The age of their empire was over. The Gralian Empire, once a colossus that towered over the galaxy, was beginning to crumble. It was a slow, almost imperceptible collapse at first, one that most of the galaxy's inhabitants would not even notice. But within the cold walls of Droth prison, the shift was clear. The Gralians were losing not to external enemies, but to an idea, a simple, profound idea: unity. Jake Mercer had turned Droth into the heart of the rebellion, and the heart was now spreading. The prisoners in Droth were no longer just resisting. They were beginning to tear the foundations of the Gralian Empire apart, piece by piece. The alliance begins. The revolt in Droth prison was just the beginning. What had started as a small insurrection in one prison cell slowly transformed into a massive, coordinated effort. Prisoners from all corners of the Gralian Empire, once isolated in their respective prisons, began to communicate. The Gralian Communications Network, once considered impenetrable, was now a tool for Jake's growing movement. The idea of resistance spread like wildfire. Species that had long been oppressed by the Gralians, each with their own grievances, began to find common ground. Jake Mercer had shown them that they didn't have to suffer in silence. They could rise together. They could reclaim their voices, their agency. The prisoners, united by Jake's vision, organized themselves into a cohesive force. They didn't have the resources, the weapons, or the might of the Gralian military, but they had something far more powerful: conviction. And it was a force the Gralians couldn't fathom, much less control. The first sign of the Gralian Empire's failure to respond effectively came when a minor Gralian outpost, one that had been a model of control for decades, suddenly declared independence. It was a small world on the edge of Gralian-controlled space, but it was the first of many. More and more planets began to question the Gralian rule. These weren't worlds that had been conquered by force. They were worlds that had been ruled by fear. And when that fear was removed, the entire system began to unravel. Jake's words, once contained in the confines of Droth prison, had spread across the galaxy like a beacon. His message was clear: we are not your tools, we are not your slaves, we are equals. The Gralian leadership in chaos. Back in the heart of the Gralian Empire, the High Command was in disarray. High Commander Vazik, who had long been the face of Gralian supremacy, could no longer hide the cracks in their empire. The once unshakable confidence that had defined the Gralian leadership was gone, replaced by fear and uncertainty. Every attempt to crush the rebellion had failed. Every effort to silence the prisoners had only made them stronger. Vazik sat in his command center, staring at the holographic map of the galaxy. It showed the Empire's territories, once vast and unchallenged, now riddled with pockets of rebellion. The Gralian fleet, once an unstoppable force, was now stretched thin, unable to respond quickly to the countless uprisings that were emerging. Entire sectors were in rebellion. And the worst part, the Gralians didn't know how to stop it. "Where are our reinforcements?" Vazik demanded, slamming his fist on the table. "Why are we losing control?" An officer stepped forward cautiously, his voice filled with hesitation. "Sir, the reinforcements are either being redirected to suppress rebellions, or they are simply not responding." Vazik's eyes narrowed in disbelief. "Not responding," he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "We've intercepted communications, sir," the officer continued. Some of the reinforcements are defecting. There are reports of Gralian soldiers refusing orders, some even joining the resistance. Vazik's face twisted with rage. This was something he hadn't anticipated. The Empire's strength had always been its unity, its obedience. If the soldiers could no longer be trusted to follow orders, if the fleet itself was losing cohesion. His mind raced. What is this human doing to us? Vazik muttered under his breath. He's just one prisoner, one human. The battle for Droth. The Gralians knew that Droth was their last stronghold. If they lost it, they lost everything. The prison was no longer just a facility, it was the symbolic heart of the Empire. If Jake Mercer and his followers succeeded in taking Droth, the Gralian Empire would be nothing more than a memory. Drav, desperate to regain control, assembled his most elite forces. They would storm Droth, crush the prisoners, and eradicate the rebellion once and for all. There could be no mercy. This was the Empire's final chance. But as Drav led the charge toward Droth, the unthinkable happened. They were met with an unexpected force. The prisoners, now united, were prepared, and what had started as a revolt had evolved into an organized resistance army. Jake Mercer was at the front, not with a weapon, but with a plan. The battle for Droth was not a war of attrition, it was a battle of wills. The prisoners, now trained and organized, fought with the determination of those who knew they had nothing left to lose. And the Gralian soldiers, who had once been proud and confident, now found themselves questioning everything they had been taught. The final negotiation. As the battle raged on, Jake Mercer's presence remained central. He wasn't just fighting for freedom. He was fighting for a new way of life, one where species could live without the Empire's tyranny. And when the Gralians realized that they could no longer win with their might alone, they finally turned to what they had once discarded: negotiation. Drav, seeing his forces faltering, made a decision. He entered the battlefield not as a commander, but as a negotiator. The Empire, it seemed, had reached its limit. The Gralians had no more tricks, no more weapons that could stop Jake and his followers. They had fought a battle they could not win. As the two sides met in the heart of Droth, the final negotiation began. Jake Mercer stood across from Drav, his expression calm, his resolve unshaken. Drav, however, was no longer the commanding officer he once was. The arrogance that had fueled him for so long had dissipated, replaced by the stark reality that his empire was broken. "You wanted to destroy us," Jake said softly, his voice carrying through the silence. "You wanted to break us, but you didn't realize that we were never going to break." Drav, his voice shaky, responded, "We were wrong, the Empire, it is finished." Jake nodded. "Yes, and now we have to decide what comes next. There is no more Empire, Drav, only what we build together." The Empire's end. As the final surrender documents were signed, the Gralian Empire ceased to exist. The transition to a new order was swift. The prisoners who had once been slaves became the architects of their future. They were no longer under the yoke of Gralian oppression. They were free. Jake Mercer, the human who had brought down the Gralian Empire, stood at the forefront of this new beginning. And as the galaxy began to change, so did the fate of Droth Prison. No longer a symbol of control, it became a symbol of liberation. But even as the Empire crumbled, a question lingered in the air. What now? Jake knew that this was just the beginning. The galaxy, fractured by years of Gralian rule, would need time to heal. New alliances would have to be formed, old wounds would have to be mended. But one thing was certain. The Gralian Empire was no more, and in its place, a new era had begun. Jake Mercer had not only toppled an empire, he had ignited a movement that would change the course of history. And as the stars shone brightly over the galaxy, Jake stood as a reminder to all who would come after him. No empire, no matter how powerful, could ever stand against the indomitable will of a people united by hope. The Gralian Empire had fallen, not through violence or war, but through something far more powerful: the belief that one human could change the course of history, and that, together, anything was possible. And as the dust settled, Jake Mercer smiled. The journey wasn't over, it had only just begun.